Your support is greatly appreciated. Please engage that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more content. This is Aberration Earth. Chapter 2. The Blanched Land. A light drizzling rain had started not a half hour ago. The pitter-patter of droplets tapped rhythmically upon Merrick's helm. The constant drone filled his ears. He kept a careful watch on his disturbing surroundings. He was curious about the wet conditions, and after noting the effect the water line along the shore seemed to have on the coloration distortions, he wanted to know if this caused a similar reaction. After an hour had passed and the rain had come and gone, he was somewhat disappointed to see that the downpour had no effect on the world around him. The same strange variances remained present. But colors were not the only unusual thing about this phenomenon. He had noted, while sitting on that rock by the beach, that some of the intrinsic qualities of the objects were seeping into one another. The stone in question, for example, had been quite soft to his touch, more like the sandy-hued bushes beside it, which felt coarse in comparison. This process appeared to be repeating wherever the bleeding occurred. Some greenery was hardened. Other things that shouldn't be were supple. One thing he had not seen yet was any wildlife, be it rodent, insect, or bird, which left him feeling uneasy. Had there been sounds, or even evidence of nesting, he would be more confident moving on. But as it stood, he wasn't certain how this environment might affect living things. With some trepidation, he decided to continue. He hadn't been able to accurately scan the coastline, and there was no record of this location available in his optical microchip, so he had no idea how large the island was. But he didn't see going around it as a better option either. After hiking for an hour, leaving him soaking wet and burdened with uncertainty, he nearly overlooked a startling shift in the terrain to his right. No more than 20 yards away, where grass and earth slid together in a mixing of greens and browns, there was a long, wide trail, alabaster-like, cutting across his sight. It was a line of pale white, which seemed to him to have no source, but was itself the absence of color, or perhaps had been inserted there unnaturally, he couldn't say. It was unnerving to his senses, and for a moment he found it disorienting, but he quickly cast his attention onto his own hand, which he held up to anchor his perspective. Now it would seem to him that what was happening was the result of some animated force he could not see, as this washing of color happened in a path, as if something were pushing through a cornfield and shoving the stalks aside as it went. Reaching for his pelter, he stopped before fully drawing the sidearm from its holster. There was nothing there that he could see, but he couldn't be sure. This world hid dangers he would have never believed. Prudence and caution had gotten him this far. He wouldn't exert energy where it wasn't needed, nor would he waste precious ammunition carelessly. So he pulled his hand back, leaving the weapon secure against his leg. What could be causing it? He hadn't the faintest idea. Perhaps it had something to do with the fairyland he had been exposed to when Grace had saved him, though this seemed entirely different in truth. Pondering what he was witnessing, Merrick remained on his chosen route, a path as directly north as he could manage, which was quite precise thanks to his internal guidance. They, the Zaxvoyan Voyagers, had been well designed for independent navigation. His sense of direction was unerringly accurate, so that even while he lacked data on this region, he knew which way he was going thanks to the biofirmware augmenting his brain. He stopped cold in his tracks less than a kilometer later, when he spotted ahead in the distance, perhaps 2 to 3 kilometers away, the distinct silhouettes of a dozen human figures standing very still along open hilly terrain. Uncertain if these were the primitive locals he had observed earlier, he continued to pace with a bit more caution, mindful that to the native people he had recorded so far, he knew he might appear as strange as any of the monstrous things that seemed to plague this world. No more than a kilometer closer, and he could make out that he was being watched. They were indistinct in their features from still so far, but he was sure those heads were all turned on him. Their garb was pale in the morning sun. He couldn't tell yet what type of cloth or armor they might be wearing. With long instruments in hand, he thought they could either be holding farming or fishing tools as easily as spears or other weapons. As he came closer, his sense of unease increased. Faces remained indistinguishable when he should have been able to make them out. Even with his enhanced vision, they were obscured. The more he looked at them, the more troubled he became. These watchmen didn't just shine in the mid-morning sun. They were shimmering as if radiating heat. It wasn't long, though, before he was able to verify his own worries. As the first of these so-called people came into clear sight, it was obvious that they were far from human. Pale wasn't an adequate description here. They were like ghosts in a certain respect, lacking any pigmentation or hue. Their skin shone a pure white, reminding him of the trails he'd seen. Merrick wondered what it meant and offered a restrained wave at the nearest of them, hoping that this gesture would be understood as a non-aggressive action, letting them know his intentions were benign. It raised its arm in turn, and he felt some of the tension within him ease. At least they were being reciprocal. It gave him hope that he might be able to hold a conversation with them, and perhaps get some help. As he was about to offer a greeting, he noticed with some horror that the thing that was parroting his hand wave was missing half of its arm. It wasn't that it was an amputee. This was much different. There were whole pieces that were just absent, as if they had been carved away perfectly, leaving gaping holes where flesh and bone should have been. But the arm was still working, as if that negative space had no impact on its ability to remain functional. And with growing alarm, he noted that it was like this across the creature's entire body. A wedge-sized section of its face was missing, leaving it with only one pitted eyeball to stare out from. It did not blink, and shifted between black and white, depending on how the light fell against it. Lowering his hand, it did the same, and he came to a stop several yards away. Now seeing it in full detail, he was left mortified by the sight, thinking that these things were more like a sad mockery of the human form. Swallowing his repulsion, he hoped that he could hold a dialogue with them, and that their very strange outward appearance was not a comment on their character. So, restraining himself from the powerful impulse to start firing indiscriminately, he spoke through his voice filter instead, letting it cycle through dozens of dialects. "I'm a traveler from another land. I mean you no harm. I'm looking for the northern shore of this island." His last word was cut off by a wailing sound that the thing suddenly began making in response, which seemed to trigger the others around it, who all did the same, causing a terrible chorus to erupt between them. He nearly didn't reach his sidearm fast enough, as the howling, deformed, crippled, quasi-human-like creature burst into action, running at him with a dull-looking spear it picked up off the ground from its feet. The nasty barbed tip was pointed right at his chest. With a curse, Merrick unloaded, landing 3 shots that punched a pair of holes through his attacker's torso, slowing it down not one bit, though the third, through its head, did, which must have hit something vital as it caused it to drop almost immediately. 5 more of the howling nightmares that he had believed to be people were only moments away, following their now dead companion's lead. They had charged in just as quickly and came within feet. Instinctively, the spaceman aimed at their heads, his decades of training and experience taking over. He brought them all down with a single shot released into each. The remaining 6 were running in opposite directions from him, fleeing as soon as their fellows had been killed, and while he had the opportunity to take them out right then, shooting them in the back wasn't something he felt was justified. After he let them go, he reloaded his weapon and squatted down to take a closer look at the nearest bodies, deciding that if these things had been human once, they were anything but human now, at least judging by their appearances. They bled out a black grainy substance from their wounds, which looked like a granulated tar, dissolving away before it could soak into the ground, with a disgusting stench strong enough to make him scrunch up his nose. The creatures wore clothing that was hard to discern from their bodies, as it was nearly as pale as their skin, pants and shirts that were tattered rags mostly, and 2 that had sandals. He discovered one had a small sack tucked into an intact pocket that held a handful of silver-pressed discs, about the size of his thumbnail. These had the head of a terrible-looking monster emblazoned on both sides. Looking at the obese icon as he held it between fingers, he realized that this might be a form of currency, either of their own design or stolen. As ridiculous as it seemed, these monsters appeared to possess a type of primitive currency, indicative of a sophistication he didn't expect. Merrick needed to know more, and watching the creatures fleeing, he noted they were heading in a northerly direction, the same way he was going, and so he decided he would follow. The continuous howling made it easy to track them, even from afar, and he allowed them a few kilometers lead. His optical chip had a firm lock on them. Utilizing both visual and audio data, he kept up the pursuit. There was no chance he would lose them. Like the bloodhound chasing the fox, he doggedly followed, keeping his distance and staying out of sight, allowing them to believe they had made good their escape. His quarry didn't begin slowing until nearly 20 kilometers later, and by then the six had converged back together after traveling separate routes since their encounter, indicating to him that they had relaxed their guard and now considered themselves safe. Ventrulus could have run them down long ago, despite their surprising speed. His training in higher gravity environments and surgical enhancements made him practically a superhuman specimen on this world. His superior height gave him a longer stride, which, combined with other advantages, allowed him to soar over the train when he was running. Moving at a speed of 25 meters per second, he could sustain the pace nearly indefinitely. Merrick traversed a high ridge before dropping down into cover along a lower tree line. His targets had come to a stop not far away, and their howls had diminished notably since this race began. Their sounds mingled with the noises of other, newer voices. The language translation software in his brain began filtering those sounds, and to his amazement, and with some alarm, he, for the first time, could make out what was being said between the creatures. Their speech was no less horrible to his ears than their appearance was to his eyes, and it was difficult not to wince as he listened to them. "A foreigner? These are good tidings. We shall bring a bounty for the new sacrament," one said with authority. They were not yet in eyesight, but the spaceman recognized the tone as someone who had command. Coming into view as he peered around a break in the trees, the six he had followed had joined with another group. They were in a caravan with 4 very large wooden wagons. Twice his height and possibly 3 to 4 times as long, all 4 were covered with iron-barred cages resting atop them. These were filled with all manners of animals, feathered, furred, and scaled. Dozens more of the quasi-humans were moving between these makeshift cargo vehicles. With lengths of chains affixed to the front ends, they were designed to be pulled by many hands. While primitive, there was an air of unspecified danger and menace around them. Beyond the gross appearance they had, there was an aura, much like one might experience if walking into a pack of wolves, or any such gathering of predatory creatures. The ones he had pursued stood in the middle of this train. They were holding council with one more like them and another, who was larger and quite different looking than the rest, standing almost as tall as himself and covered in armor quite unlike anything he had ever seen before. A shifting miasma of black and white steel flickered outwards into the air around the being, causing fissures in space itself, it seemed. The fantastical effect made Merrick's head slightly dizzy. He made sure to keep himself out of sight, hugging his large frame behind the trees and making no movements, not even a breath to escape his lips. Focusing on details, he noted the armored figure held a sword in its right hand, an unnaturally bright metal that seemed to twist around itself and writhe with a life of its own, pulsing as if it had a living heart hidden within. The 6 deferentially bowed forward towards the figure at their center. One of them spoke, offering explanations. "It had teeth, my lord. But that voice was silenced, as their armored leader plunged a blade straight into the creature's chest without warning, killing it instantly. Indifferently, the sword wielder removed the corpse from its weapon, placing a metal boot against its head and forcefully shoving it away, letting it drop with a thud as dead flesh landed against hard earth. The other 5 stood frozen, while the one who was their leader tilted its helmeted head towards them and said, "As do all things of worth, power, strength, courage. These things have no meaning before the will of the sacred baptism. We have no meaning. Only the dreams of our holy worm give the world purpose. Dropping to their knees, they began to grovel and writhe at its feet. More around them followed suit, muttering and chanting what sounded to him almost like prayers. All blessings for he who guides us, our worm who dwells both here and in heaven. We honor your pain and bring you this bread. Take it to ease the suffering you endure for us, we, your faithful and worthless subjects. Scanning the caravan further, he spotted a white flag, which bore a single blood-red tear in its corner, flapping ominously on the side of one of their wagons. Then it came back to him, and Merrick remembered the warning the fairy Grace had given him, lyrical words that whispered in his head. Worshippers of the weeping worm, it is said they were men who bathed in its sorrows and were changed forever. Bled of color, their souls have been stripped bare. If you see their banner flying in all white with nothing but a single bloody tear falling from the corner, you'd best be going in the other direction. He knew then that he had stumbled upon the Blanched, and this island, it was very likely their land. The knight raised its voice, lifting its sword as it did, as if that somehow amplified its words. Abject failures, it addressed them with an audible sneer. Heed my commandment. We return to the shimmering city. My brothers and I will find this foreigner. Yes, Sir Tarmor, his attendants groveled in reply, revealing the warrior's name. Turning his head to the 5 holding court with him, he declared, while dismissing them with a wave of his hand, You will pay penance at the first temple. May the worm's will guide you to a fitting oblivion, or not. Your concerns are no longer my own. They whimpered in despair, but obeyed, shuffling away from the armored figure, who began scanning the perimeter, as others hurried to secure the caravan, preparing to leave. Merrick did not like what he had just overheard. It left him with limited options and a window for decisions that was closing fast. Let them go and risk facing a squad of these unnatural warriors coming after him later, or confront this one now and put an end to that possibility before it could happen. Tarmor was only one knight. He had no idea how many more there could be, and he would guess by looking at the thing that they were much more capable than the lesser creatures serving them. It did not, however, indicate that they would be any less susceptible to his pelter, and he drew his sidearm preemptively with that in mind. He was alone in a strange world, confronted with beings and creatures he had up until recently believed only existed in stories of myth. It was a reality his psyche was still wrestling with. Only time would reveal if his mind could come to terms with these truths, or if they would break him and leave a shattered soul in their unraveling. But in the present, the highly trained space explorer focused himself on the less abstract issues he could practically address. Since survival was his primary concern, as all other issues were moot if he did not continue to live, his decision was ultimately driven by that. Holding his gun in a two-handed grip, he steadied himself while accessing his optical microchip, using it to project a three-dimensional holographic map into his brain. He tracked the position of everything within that caravan, the so-called knight, his servants, and a living prisoner he detected on one of their wagons. They had at least one human as cargo, and by the looks of it, this was no primitive man, as he wore pieces of a black armor that partially covered the torso, shoulders, and upper legs, potential signs of sophisticated manufacturing. The armor appeared to be made of a composite material. It was a tantalizing hint at the possibility of a more advanced civilization, as only more sophisticated engineering could produce something like that. The wheels in his head clicked, and thought now turned to action. Merrick took aim and unloaded 3 rounds at the Blanched Knight's head, the trio striking the target with unerring accuracy. Sir Tarmor did not fall. His strange armor shifted unnaturally, and black cracks snapped outwards, reaching forth from it, splitting the air, it seemed to him. His shots vanished before his eyes. Not good, he thought, as the armored figure turned to look directly at him. Pointing, it cried with a voice that was filled with loathsome outrage. "Blasphemy! Bring me that heretic!" In the next few moments, there was an explosion of activity as the quasi-humanoid creatures came rushing into the woods, hurrying to surround him and prevent escape. A dozen were down before they could make it halfway to his position. The sounds of the weapon discharging was followed by the pathetic wailing of the monsters. Ventrulus pulled out a canister from his backpack and threw it hard to the ground, causing it to shoot out a cloud of thick bluish smoke from both ends, filling the woods around him with a dense gas and affording him some cover. The forlorn noises of the creatures were coming from every direction. They were desperately searching for him within the cloud, but they stumbled blindly about, clawing and stabbing at the empty air with their crude weaponry. Slipping between them unseen, he was careful as he moved, unloading his sidearm with uncanny accuracy through the blue haze, expertly dispatching them one by one. Within minutes, 4 dozen were dead, leaving only their armored leader standing. A much more reasonable prospect for the spaceman now that he was no longer outnumbered. Merrick didn't come directly at the Blanched Knight. Instead, he made full use of his cover and climbed a tall tree to launch himself towards the enemy, holstering his pelter in favor of a spear he had taken from one of the fallen creatures. Sir Tarmor remained unmoving. Only at the last possible moment did he react, and with inhuman reflexes he raised his sword and with a clash, deflected aside the spear point with the flat of his blade, forcing the spaceman to roll past before springing to his feet to face him again. Lunging, he thrust the sharp end at his foe repeatedly, but the knight danced out of the way, waiting for his opportunity to counter. Despite their size, the pair moved with sublime grace. When he did, the Blanched lashed out like a viper, acting faster than any human could have. Ventrulus barely avoided the edge of his weapon, which sliced through the shaft of the spear he was holding, leaving it in 2 pieces. Disarmed, he pulled out his pelter once more and fired off a pair of slugs almost at point-blank range, hitting his opponent in the chest, but like before, they were swallowed by this enemy's supernatural armor. Merrick cursed and jumped higher than one might think would be possible for a man of his astounding size. Soaring over his enemy's head, he managed to squeeze off another 6 rounds, while gracefully twisting through the air. His armored target remained unaffected, his innate protection keeping him safe and free from harm, not a single slug making it through. The knight spun to catch him with his blade as he came down, but he underestimated the spaceman's trajectory and only managed to cut through empty air, while Ventrulus landed several yards away. Merrick didn't waste a second and charged into his opponent, his speed catching the other by surprise, allowing him to get in under the next blade thrust. Dropping low, he grabbed hold of his enemy by the wrist and with the momentum, sent him tumbling away. Forced to release his grip, the knight dropped his sword, which came to rest on the ground directly beside him. Picking up that strange pulsing weapon nearly made him retch on contact. Writhing like a bundle of snakes in his palm despite its gleaming appearance, it caused a sickening feeling to worm its way into his gut. He held on despite the repulsive sensations it forced upon him. An unnatural weapon for an inhuman foe. He would turn it against its owner, since his own weapon proved unequal to the task. Sir Tarmor rose from the ground, standing almost as tall as the spaceman and twice as broad, staring at him as they sized each other up anew. Merrick was upright on one knee, holding the edged instrument out to his right side, ready to continue the fight. Now that they were up close to one another, he could see the contorting lines that moved across the Blanched Knight's armor, constantly shifting between black and white, pulsating in and out of the material universe, a maddening contradiction to the senses. Lancing towards him, a single rod of the stuff had separated itself to float freely in front of its master, before being shot with a silent command. It was a display of impossible power. Leaping upwards to evade the attack, the space explorer launched himself into the higher branches of the nearest tree, where grabbing hold he perched precariously, looking down. Tarmor didn't afford him a moment's respite, as his odd abilities exercised themselves in another way, this time stretching out from his back in geometric lines that crisscrossed each other, forming for him a set of rudimentary wings, which he immediately used. Flying straight for him, his foe launched another attack, perforating the foliage around Ventrulus with a barrage of flying flechettes, weakening the branch he rested on and causing it to give way. As he fell, Merrick's predictive abilities worked unerringly, thanks to the optical microchip feeding data to the processor in his brain, and he correctly forecast the enemy's trajectory, timing the swing of the sword he still held in hand, with the moment he was within reach. Perfectly executed, his counterattack landed against the knight's left arm, severing it at the shoulder, even as he felt the sting of a dozen of those pointed projectiles piercing his body. Smashing together, the pair tumbled back towards the ground, where they landed hard, both bouncing with a tooth-rattling impact that left the spaceman stunned and disarmed as he dropped the sword from his hand. It found its way back to its owner, who, despite being freshly bereft of an entire limb, scooped it up with his one good hand as he recovered to a standing position in short order. Tarmor looked down on the winded Zaxvoyan, whose face was now bloodied, thanks to a gruesome wound that ran across the bridge of his nose. Merrick rolled away and got himself up on one knee, where he drew his sidearm once more, knowing, as ineffective as it had been, it was better than nothing at all. And perhaps there was still a chance to find a weakness that could be exploited. A part of him breathed a sigh of relief when the Blanched knight unexpectedly soared away, taking flight to make good his escape, while another part of him groaned out of frustration, for now he had to worry that he had made an enemy who was not alone, and most likely would come looking for him with others of his kind. It wasn't like he could mount a chase. Even if he had wanted to, he had no way of following Tarmor without flight capabilities. That equipment was gone with the loss of their ship. So, he let off a few rounds with little expectation that he'd be able to stop the enemy's withdrawal, and watched until his adversary disappeared, dropping beneath a rise several kilometers away along a mountain ridge. He wasn't sure why the knight had left the fight so abruptly, but he suspected the loss of his arm may have been a factor, despite his seeming indifference. With something close to a victory under his belt, he turned his attention to the abandoned caravan now behind him, where numerous creatures were left caged, along with one man of particular interest. Ventrulus began breaking open the pens. They were made of the same odd metal as the knight's armor. It took him some time to get them all open, even with his technologically enhanced strength. He soon discovered there were other humans here, most of them primitive, dressed in rags and handmade garments. These ones ran away as soon as they were set loose. His own appearance was likely as intimidating as their captors. Being a half-meter taller than the one who had locked them up, he was an imposing presence. And with the explosion of violence that had just unfolded, these people were justly terrified. Animals of all types were also counted, four-legged and feathered. It seemed like the caravan collected anything living. For what ends he could only imagine. The last one he released was the man he had spotted earlier, who wore more sophisticated armor. With short cropped black hair and steely black eyes, his shoulders bore the markings of a stylized insignia beneath, which he thought might be a ranking of some kind. He broke the lock open with his bare hands, to which the man gave him an appraising look with a raised brow. It was a strength born on another world, and not natural to the people of this planet. Merrick stepped back to indicate he was letting him out, to which the captive sprung up onto his feet from his sitting position and calmly exited, holding his rescuer's gaze and giving a slight smile of gratitude as he came through. Translation software kicking into action, the stranger said to him, quite clearly, "Thank you. You are not a servant of the worm. I have never seen a man like you before. Who are you?" Audio modulator activated. Ventrulus spoke in the foreign tongue of the man. The new language being actively catalogued and processed came out amazingly accurate, yet still had a slight accent to the other's ears. "My name is Merrick. I'm from a far-off land. Are you unharmed?" The man nodded that he was. Looking up at the massive figure of his liberator, towering almost a full meter taller than himself, and taking a deep breath, he said in a rush, Keel slugs. You're a tough one. I've never seen anyone single-handedly deal one of the knights a slop cup like that. I appreciate the timely rescue, Merrick. The name's Jenker. Officially, Gencurius Damad of the Nautic and Marine Forces, proud member of the Royal Havenite Grand Fleet. It was an unusually colorful vernacular. The translation software worked overtime to refine his understanding of what was being spoken. Filled with slang and coarse vulgarities, likely specific to the community he had originated from. By his claim, Jenker belonged to an ocean-going group, a fact that was of great interest to the spaceman, who himself had found the water crossings pointedly difficult endeavors. Merrick swallowed the rising hope that this man might have some answers for him. He had faced too many difficulties to let any expectations get the better of him, even if it seemed he was closer to achieving his goal. He looked malnourished and mistreated, sporting many bruises. He had dark rings under his eyes and the stench of several days without wash. Pulling out a dried food strip from his pack, he offered the item to the freed prisoner, who only gave it a brief look before taking it happily. Ventrulus took another piece for himself. Chomping on it, he asked, "Havenite Grand Fleet? I'm sorry, I've never heard of it. Are you military?" Jenker's eyes practically bulged out, answering with a dismissive scoff. "Bilge sacks. We're Navy. Every Havenite is. Even the most useless skunk brine one can find in the dregs of the harbor. There's not a man, woman, or child who doesn't serve. It's our calling. You haven't heard of us? You must be from really far then. Everyone knows the Grand Fleet, at least on this side of the world. Where do you come from anyway?" "No offense intended. As I said, I do come from afar, a place called Leopold 7. The spaceman explained as he took out a flask of hyper-condensed water, offering it after taking a short sip. "Not too much. A mouthful should be enough to rehydrate you." After giving him a questioning look, the Havenite took a drink as instructed. His eyes widened with amazement, his body rapidly feeling the replenishing effects of the liquid as it went to work. The substance was created in a lab, another invention of necessity for the colonists, whose later advancements such as this were steered by harsh conditions they had to deal with over the germination of their society. Moving down towards the end of the wagon, the man named Jenker began rummaging through boxes that had been loaded onto an upper compartment, pulling them out and flipping the lids off with a grunting two-handed effort. Following along, Merrick stepped in to help, using one hand to haul the crates free and opening them with a kick of a foot, making it look easy in comparison. While his new company rummaged through each container, Ventrulus wondered what he was looking for. Likely lost belongings, he thought. But he didn't bother inquiring, deciding the man had endured enough already. Going from crate to crate, Damad cursed under his breath as he searched through one before hastily moving on to the next, finally half turning back to his company to remark, "Leopold 7. I've never heard of it." "We have something in common then," the spaceman exclaimed, the hint of a grin forming at the corner of one side of his mouth, visible even through the visor of his helm. Jenker stopped for a moment and laughed, remarking, "I didn't think I had that in me anymore. You've given me hope, stranger from a far-off land. I thought I'd lost that." With that, the Havenite continued foraging, while Merrick went on pulling out goods from where the caravan master had stored their captives' belongings, along with other treasures and junk that they had been collecting. It was less of the former and more of the latter, in truth. Broken ceramic pieces and bits of steel, for the most part, a collection of useless refuse with the occasional item of note. Occasionally, Jenker would find something he recognized, or that belonged to him, and pocket it, tucking whatever it was up under his armor, or into a pouch on a new belt he had found for himself. That warrior, his name was Sir Tarmor. Is he what is known as a Blanched knight? The spaceman asked conversationally, becoming more relaxed around the man he'd freed. "Soppy sea goose. Aye, he's one of them," the Havenite replied, speaking as he continued his search through the various crates they had unloaded. "Caught us by surprise when we came up for air, rode on some kind of sky chariot with wings. Not often do the pale ones make it out over the water like that. forced the captain to prematurely submerge, leaving half of us stranded on the deck as it flooded over. Unacceptable, Merrick stated, appalled they would have been abandoned like that. There was no choice. None of us would blame the captain. It was either that or lose the Nautica, Damat explained as he looked under a pile and spotted something that caught his interest, reaching for it and yanking. I understand, Ventrulus said, coming over to help him pull out what he had grabbed hold of. We were easy pickings for those vultures. After they finished their killing and fishing the rest of us up out of the water, we were dropped off and dumped into the caravans. I ended up alone with that one. These kraken holes were taking us to the Shimmering City before you changed all that. Aha! Jenker exclaimed with some excitement as he finally recovered what he had been looking for. A wood-lined box inlaid with metal and sporting a crank with a handle protruding on the back. What is it? The spaceman asked quizzically, looking over the other's shoulder. The Havenite smirked and gave the handle a turn before explaining. It whirred with the action as he continued to move it around, producing the recognizable sound of an electrical charge. Manual transmitter. We have to hurry. Once that snot-boiled Tarmor reaches the city, they'll be coming for us. A self-powering technology, simple and reliable, certainly crafted by human hands. It was another piece of evidence that pointed to this actually being Earth. Merrick considered the Havenite's words before saying to him, Let's head north. I need to reach the shore before that happens. North? That's much too close to the Shimmering City. We'd as well march ourselves into the jaws of the damned worm. We have to go west. That's the closest shoreline from here and where my people can pick us up. Come with me, Merrick. I owe you for saving my skin. If you need to go north after that, I promise we can take you there. Jenker shook his head, suggesting the alternative instead. There really was no better option, he thought to himself. Ventrulus had more questions and his new companion might have some of the answers he was looking for. Thus he decided his best chance at finding those was sticking together for now, and so he replied, All right, I'd rather avoid any more of those nights. Let's go, Jenker. To the north, Sir Tarmor soared low to the ground, skirting the edges just outside of the Shimmering City. He had left his enemy behind, but had decided he couldn't be too careful and had maintained a low altitude to gain cover from the trees, hills, and ridgelines. He let out an irritated growl. He was incensed at the wound he had suffered thanks to that infidel, a man quite unlike any he had ever seen before. Using his own sword to steal away one of his arms, that was an unforgivable affront. The heretic would suffer. He vowed to himself that he would bathe him personally under the fountain of their god's tears and see him scrubbed clean, leaving behind either a dead shell or a mewling sycophant to serve them for the rest of eternity. The beautiful strobing lights from the city flashed over him, causing his own armored figure to shift between dark and light. The architecture here was designed to redirect that luminescence, creating a shimmering effect across the whole of the metropolis, which is what gave this place its name. He turned in and headed towards the first temple, going over rooftops and roadways that flashed periodically to make a landing in the outer grounds of the holiest of buildings in the entire city. As soon as he came to rest on solid ground, Tarmor sensed something amiss. He could see many more priests present than would be expected in the courtyard and along the pathways surrounding the gigantic edifice. Led by their chained sycophants, they all had their hooded heads cocked skywards as if listening to the wind. It would be the wrong assumption, though, for the priests of the Weeping Worm were deaf, in addition to being without sight. The cacophony of chatter coming from those around him wasn't quite right. Not that there wasn't always present the sounds of the priests as they delivered their sermons haphazardly for any to hear, but it had rarely been so exceptionally loud. What was strange, he soon realized, was the complete absence of the usual sorrowful lamentations that should be echoing forth from the first temple. He could not hear that morose chorus in the background. The worm had gone quiet. Something was very wrong, and Tarmor marched directly for the nearest priest to find answers. Alerted to his presence by the servile sycophant attached to him, the hooded man lowered his head, ready to greet the wounded knight. The servant rapidly tapped its fingers against the top of the priest's hand, a form of communication used exclusively between the pairs, and one that the knights were not privy to, conveying everything the holy man needed to know, hindered as he was by his lack of eyes or ears. As Tarmor approached, the priest called out to him, "Sir Tarmor, we have been awaiting your arrival." Stopping mid-stride, the Blanched knight was taken aback by the fact the priest knew him by name. For among the Blanched, there were very few associations, and even less between the castes. More troubling was the fact that every other priest around the area was clearly moving towards him now, with all their attention fully turned in his direction. There was little that could unnerve him, up to and including the removal of his own arm. However, he was now decidedly unsettled, and placed his one good hand on the pommel of his sword to comfort himself. In a tone dripping with barely contained contempt, Tarmor addressed the priest. "The advantage is yours, foul one. Which one of you do I have the displeasure of addressing?" Relations between the knights and the priests were tepid at best. The former saw the latter as soft, and possessed of a certain degree of self-importance that they thought was undeserving, while the latter viewed the former as beneath them in the hierarchy of their kind. The holy leaders were favored, and yet never or rarely engaged in anything more than glorified administrative chores, in the eyes of the knights at least. On the other hand, the crusader class, the warriors like Tarmor, to the priests, were viewed as expendable, for it was indeed their numbers who were the first to venture forth and risk themselves in battle beyond the confines of the city. "I am Brother Kygale," the holy man answered with a thin smile, exposing ghastly rotting teeth, after his servant had translated what he had said through a series of taps delivered upon the back of his hand. "Archminister of Sufferance. Yes, I have heard of you. One of the few who aren't so useless if the stories are true," the armored warrior stated, speaking honestly, switching between being dismissive to mildly respectful. Every knight knew of Kygale. He was one of those known to occasionally join their warriors in the field. His reputation was one of competence. "Your praise is unbecoming, Sir Tarmor, for one whose existence orbits the twin system of abject misery and hopeless despondence. But enough pleasantries. We have been waiting for you. A great turning has occurred, a shift in the miasma of the Divine One's dreaming. You have been foreseen in our visions. You are to abscond to the highest of holy orders without delay." Flecks of yellow spittle flew from the priest's mouth as he talked. A tooth cracked in half with the violent clicking of his teeth. The Blanched knight gave no outward clue as to the state of his mind. His flesh was long gone, washed away in the tears of their god, and such nuances of human life had gone along with it. But what passed for his heart skipped a beat at hearing that proclamation. He was an agent of the weeping worm, a piece of that holy being's desires, a fist made incarnate, and he was being told his presence was demanded by the entity who had created them. It was an unprecedented blessing, and Tarmor's soul wailed silently, for the devoted of the grieving god had no love within them, only fear and the hatred born from that. "The blessed worm has wakened from its dreaming, brother?" The Blanched knight stated the obvious to the priest, who merely bowed slightly, signaling the affirmative. "He has, and he has spoken," the priest declared with an intense passion, rising higher as he did, his dirty sandal-clad feet shuffling towards him, causing the knight to suddenly take a small unconscious step backwards. "These are his words. Tarmor the Tarnished will return to the Shimmering City, brought low and shamed, defeated by a heretic from another world. He will wallow in me. He will be washed clean and renewed in the glorification of sufferance, and upon his rebirth,
He will lead my great crusade and raise the lands in my name, for the heretic must be brought before me and judged, as his coming portends our possible end."
Legs shaking uncontrollably, the knight looked towards the first temple, to which the smiling Kygale gestured with his hand, indicating that was the path he was expected to follow. Helplessly, he began to walk forward, his limbs seemingly moving of their own accord, holding back a moan of despair that sought to escape his throat. Facing one's God in the flesh would be a humbling experience for the adherent of any faith. Going before the great worm was degrees more terrifying, and that was when it was asleep. Now risen from its dreaming, Tarmor could only imagine what this would be like, and as he would soon learn, it would indeed be infinitely worse. To the southwest, the two men hiked as fast as they could, speaking little, conserving their energy as much as possible. Jenker was the slower of the two. He had been held captive for the last 4 days without food, and given little water in that time. As a result, his physique had suffered. By no means was he left a weakling for it. He had been taxed and now moved accordingly. Merrick considered offering to carry him, but he could see the naval serviceman yet carried himself with pride and would not presume to insult him with the offer. After being here less than a day, the spaceman couldn't wait to get off this island. As his new companion explained it to him, the Blanched land was a place devoid of hope, and most life as he knew it. All things that found themselves here were either fed to the ravenous being known as the Weeping Worm or transformed, becoming something less than human, like the knight and sycophants he had encountered. There were 3 types who served the worm, the 2 they had already clashed with, the knights and sycophants, and a third known as the priests. Jenker muttered a thankful prayer, grateful that they had avoided encountering any of those, for their powers were much closer to their twisted gods, and would likely have put an end to their escape. Ventrulus wasn't sure of that, but he took the words seriously out of a sense of prudence, and he made a mental note to be mindful if he were ever to meet one in the future. To his relief, a beach suddenly came into sight. Behind it, the welcoming view of the vast ocean, and not long after, upon the wind, the familiar scent of salt water. Demad hadn't steered him wrong. Going west had proven to be the right decision. The pair slowed their pace as they got closer. The sounds of the surf lapping against the rock and along the sandy span came to their ears. The setting sun in the distance ahead cast out long fingers of pink and orange over their heads. Jenker pulled out his wooden box and adjusted the knobs on the front. They made a clicking sound as they were turned. Then he gave the handle a few cranks. Just like he had done several times throughout the leg of their run here, he hit the big button on top, claiming it sent out a signal with their coordinates embedded within it to his ship. In the distance, birds could be seen crossing the sky on the prowl for a meal, never coming in their direction. The animals seemed to be avoiding this tainted land of the Blanched. Thinking back on it, he couldn't recall seeing any living animal here until the caravan, until he'd found Jenker. Watching them in the distance as the Havenite cranked his transmitter, Merrick remarked to him, "The animals, they avoid this place. I didn't see any in my hike from the southern coast. Not until I ran into that group that held you captive. Oh yeah, those that can fly or swim, they know better. Even the dumbest creatures can sense doom approaching. That's all these keel leeches can offer," Damad answered, as their trot slowed to a walk, while his attention remained fixed on working his device. "I didn't spot this land when I was looking from a distance. If I had, I would have likely avoided it," Ventrulus commented. "Be bloody smart if you had," the Havenite quipped. "Maybe, but it wouldn't have been so good for you," the spaceman returned, giving his companion a knowing look. Snorting, the man called Jenker laughed as he responded, "Ha, true. The Blanched land often can't be seen until you're practically on top of it. They say it's because of the shimmering city. It fools the eyes of onlookers." His box made a ding. The sound caused the seaman's eyes to widen as he exclaimed, "Thank the old father. They've received the signal." Staring out at the waves, Merrick looked for a ship to appear, but saw nothing,
and as the minutes ticked past, he began to wonder if his new friend wasn't mistaken. "I don't see anything yet," he said. "Patience, it won't be long. We have some time. Let's find some cover and keep watch," the Havenite replied, tucking his box under his arm and scoping around for a suitable position. Finding a spot with some cover for them, provided by a pair of old logs, the two men took turns scanning the water and the tree line. Jenker cast his rescuer a quizzical look and said, "Tell me more about you, friend. I feel like you know more about me than I do you now." As second in command aboard the Cazoose, Ventrulus was not just responsible for ship discipline, but his own as well, and in that role, he was the model for all others. He had been careful since the crash, with whom he exposed himself to, and the information he shared. It was second nature to him. Now, however, he thought this man who held potential answers to the mysteries they faced deserved his honesty, and so, with that in mind, he answered, saying, "That's fair enough. Excuse my caution. I haven't had an easy journey. Fighting that night was no exception. As I said before, I'm from a place we call Leopold 7. It is in a distant star system, another world." The Havenite gave the spaceman a long look. Whatever judgments he was forming were his alone. His face betrayed nothing. Letting out a long breath after taking a moment to think, Jenker responded, "Right, never heard of it. Your gear is advanced though, that's for sure. I mean, you don't really speak my language, do you? I think you're using some fancy translator, and that weapon, it isn't like anything I've seen before. But how do I know you're not a few boots loose in the crow's nest? That's a hell of a claim you're making." Translation issues aside, the Zaxvoyan was impressed. This man had a sharp mind, and he recognized the workings of machinery that were likely significantly more advanced than his own. Is it? Is it any wilder than Blanched knights, dragons, and fairies? Let me ask you something. Is this Earth? Is this the third planet in the Sol system? Ventrulus proposed to him thoughtfully, as he finally made the inquiry he had desperately wanted to ask since coming here. "Wait, you mean our world? Not the dirt under our feet? Ha! What else would it be called? Of course it's Earth." The Havenite gave him an easy smile before turning his eyes back to the ocean. "So, this is Earth," he stated, as a sense of relief washed over him. "I'm not sure if you're joking with me, but when did you see dragons and fairies?" Damad asked, his brow furrowing slightly with a touch of concern, he thought. "On the island before this one, a fire-breathing dragon and a strange machine pursued me. I was saved by a pretty girl who told me she was one of the Fae. She led me through her world to escape them," Merrick detailed as he watched the woods behind them. Jenker looked visibly perturbed. His facial expression tightened, before exclaiming loudly, "Great guardians! Old Father's favor must be upon you. If the Chaos Drake and the God Machine have an interest in you, it's a miracle you escaped. Do me a favor, though. Don't mention the Fae when we meet the crew. My people do not have any love for those things." Before they could say any more, the air before them sizzled, and a terrible stench drifted outwards from a black line that began moving horizontally not far away. As if cutting through space, it turned vertically, before going horizontal and then vertical again, completing the outline of a rectangle that hung suspended in the air before them. Filling with a familiar shifting white and black energy, the two men stood immediately, Ventrulus reaching for his sidearm instinctively. They watched in mounting horror as a one-armed figure slowly began to emerge, pushing through the mirror to step upon the sand, only a few dozen feet away from where they were. Sir Tarmor's armored form was recognizable, and yet somehow had drastically changed, thickened, and harsher in appearance. He had become larger, and was possibly as tall as the spaceman himself now. He had broadened at the shoulders, and fierce edges now extended from enlarged pauldrons. The points on his ornate helm were lengthened, and the surface of his shifting plate now blurred with the emission of steaming heat waves. Lines of crimson red ran from both eye sockets, like bloody trails staining down either cheek. They stood out like a banner against the normal blandness of the Blanched knight's suit. A red cape attached to the neck flapped vigorously in the breeze behind him, while steel boots now sporting studded treads cracked the rocks beneath his weight. The ominous blade at his hip glowed a deep purple, and as he unsheathed it, it released a cry that seemed to have been captured within, projecting a force that knocked the man named Jenker right off his feet and brought Merrick down onto one knee. There ends our chapter. Until next time, thanks for listening. Please engage the like button and subscribe to the channel for more content.